reasons to believe so. So it's really nice to be able to be a part of this. As I thought about when I got the invitation to possibly speak here this morning, I thought about, well, what can I tell you that you haven't heard from Hugh? Hugh has been a great influence in my life as far as integrating science and Christianity. And much of what I would say has been influenced by him and would reflect many of his views. So I thought there's not a lot I can tell you that you can't get from him as far as science and scripture and things like that. But one thing I can do is I can tell you a little bit about my journey into particle physics, which is what I do now. And many of the lessons that I've learned along the way are lessons that you have probably learned yourself if you've been a Christian for some time, but maybe as I share some of my journey, how I got to where I am today, it'll help you see God in a better way. It'll help affirm some of the things you know about God, and it'll give you a picture of how God works in different people's lives. So I'm a professor at the University of Oklahoma. The University of Oklahoma is a major research university, and so my job is not primarily teaching, although I teach, but my job is primarily research. I do my research at CERN Laboratory, which is near Geneva, Switzerland, and I study something, the experimental, the smallest particles in the universe. We'll talk a little bit about that. So I'm going to tell you a little bit about my research, and then I'll tell you my story of how I got to where I am now. So here's a picture of CERN Laboratory. It sits on the border of Switzerland and France, and it's the world's premier particle physics laboratory right now. Particle physics, the goal is to study the smallest structure of the universe and understand how the universe is put together. What are the fundamental building blocks of the universe? So here is kind of a picture. If you Google, the building blocks of the universe or elementary particles, you'll get a picture like this. I am a physics professor, so there will be a quiz at the end, and this will be on the quiz, so you want to take good notes. We know that's a joke. I have to tell my class because of my sense of humor, I have to tell my class initially when I'm making a joke, and by end of the semester, they kind of get it. But we know that the universe is made of atoms. Atoms have at their core a nucleus. The nucleus is made of neutrons and protons are made of quarks. I have actually spent much of my career, about 25, 30 years, studying quarks and how they are put together in neutrons and protons. But over the last 10 years or something, I've been studying something different, which I'll talk about. So the goal of particle physics is to understand how the universe is put together. So suppose you wanted to know how a proton was put together, but you had no tools to take a proton apart. Or say something more familiar. Suppose you wanted to know how a car was put together, but you had no tools to understand how to look inside a car and see what makes it work, or take the car apart. What would you do? How would you see inside the car? Well, if you're a particle physicist, you would get the car going very, very fast, and you would get another car going very, very fast, and you'd smash the two cars together, and you'd see the debris that comes out, and that would tell you how the car is put together. So this is what we do, not with cars, but with protons. There is a collider called the Large Hadron Collider. It's about 17 miles in circumference and about 100 meters underground, 100 yards underground. And this yellow line shows you the outline of where the particle collider is underground. To give you some sense of scale, this here is the Geneva airport. You can kind of see the runway. This is Lake Geneva, and the main city of Geneva is over here, kind of. The main lab section is over here, but yet it runs under much of the Swiss-French countryside. In fact, the border of Switzerland and France is this dotted line, with this side being Switzerland and this side being France. If you were to go underneath the tunnel, you would see these big superconducting collider or superconducting magnets. That's what these blue things are. And you can see kind of the curvature of the tunnel. This picture gives you some size of the scale. And these little things here, these are tubes that carry protons nearly the speed of light in two different directions. And every once in a while, the protons going in one direction and the protons coming the other direction will actually bring the tubes together. and we'll smash those protons together. 40 million times a second, we smash protons together. And when we do that, about 10 to 50 protons might actually collide. They're put in little packets of about 100 trillion protons, and those 100 trillion protons will pass through another packet of 100 trillion protons, and about 40 or so will collide 40 million times a second. So we want to see what happens when they collide. Here's an artist's depiction of that tunnel, and then a cavern where we're going to build a detector, which is really a camera to see subatomic particles. I work at this detector called the Atlas detector. It's housed inside the largest man-made cavern in the world because it's quite large. Here's a picture, a drawing of the Atlas detector. Here's some people to give you some size scale. And protons will come in this way, nearly the speed of light in one pipe. They'll come in this way in one pipe. They'll collide in the center. And when they collide, you get a whole bunch of subatomic debris that looks something like this. And the computer takes pictures of this. And then our job is to understand what happened when the protons first collided right in the center here, because that is going to tell us how the universe is put together. If you follow science news, this was one of the 2 experiments that discovered the Higgs boson in 2012, named after this gentleman here, Peter Higgs, who first predicted that this particle should exist in the early 1960s. He shared the Nobel Prize with Francois Englert, who also made this prediction. And I was one of the 7,000 physicists who played a role in discovering this particle back in 2012. So what I've been doing over the last 10 years or so is trying to understand the Higgs boson. It's one thing to discover it. It's another thing to really understand its properties and what it tells us about the universe. And that's what I've been doing over the last 10 years or so. So not only am I a particle physicist, but I'm also a Christian. People ask, can you be a scientist and a Christian? And of course, you deal with Hugh Ross all the time, so you know that is quite possible to be both. But the path for me to become a scientist was quite a very roundabout way. I actually come from a family of theologians. My grandfather was a traveling pastor and speaker, a guy named Strauss. He wrote 14 books. I still run into people all the time who heard him speak. But he mostly, his ministry was at various Christian conferences, primarily on the East Coast. My dad was also a pastor. He was pastor of a church in San Diego County for 20 years before his death in 1993. And I come from a family of 3 brothers. So here we are when we were quite young. Out of my other 3 brothers, 2 of them were seminary professors and 2 of them were missionaries. One was both a seminary professor and a missionary. That's how you do the counting. So clearly, you know, my background, the table talk around Christmas is theology and things like that, and certainly not science. My dad did pass away in 1993. He had a great preaching ministry before that. And my mom runs a website called Spiritual Gold, in which she keeps all my dad's messages from 30 or more years ago there. So every once in a while, if you want to go hear, if I want to go hear my dad's voice, I can go hear his messages. So again, I come from a family of theologians. I was born in Fort Worth, Texas, when my dad was a student at Dallas Theological Seminary. He was studying to get a PhD in theology. And when I was born, the then president of Dallas Seminary, Dr. Walvard, John Walvard, wrote my dad a letter congratulating him on my birth, although my mom had much more to do with my birth. But nevertheless, John Walvard wrote a letter to my dad congratulating him on my birth and saying that if I ever wanted to get into Dallas Seminary when I grew up, that I would be able to do that because I guess for one reason or another. So we'll talk more about that as we go on. This will all tie together. When my dad graduated from seminary, this was in the height of the space race. So let's go here. And there was a small church in Huntsville, Alabama, which built the bottom stage of the Saturn V rocket that took people to the moon. And there were a bunch of very well-educated engineers moving to Huntsville, and they wanted a pastor who had a doctorate degree to try to minister to these engineers. But it was a small church with no money. And so they called Dallas Seminary and said, do you have a new graduate who will come here and work for very little money? And my dad said yes. And so that's how I got to Huntsville, Alabama. And this is probably why I'm a physicist today, because I grew up during the race to the moon, and I was fascinated by the space race. I made plastic models of all the capsules that took us to the moon. The picture over here on the left is a picture, of them testing the bottom stage of the Saturn V rocket. This huge rocket, the most powerful rocket so far ever built. They would actually strap the bottom stage into this machine. They would turn it on full force to test the engines, and the whole town of Huntsville, Alabama would shake and rattle because of the power of these engines. You'll talk to many scientists my age, and they will say over and over the same thing. It was this fascination with our adventure into space which eventually led them to becoming scientists. And I would say that is certainly a big part of my story. When I was in junior high, my dad got a call from a church in California to go out there and be a pastor. He didn't really want to. God was blessing his ministry in Alabama. But after prayer and much consideration, he took this church in Escondido, California, Emmanuel Faith Community Church. And for about 20 years, he was the senior pastor of Emmanuel Faith Community Church. So California is where I consider home, because I spent, my high school and my college and my graduate school years. We'll talk about that there. When I graduated from high school, I wasn't sure what I wanted to do in life. I knew I had no role models in science, but I liked science. I had a good chemistry teacher in high school who gave me a fascination with science. And of course, I was surrounded by theologians. So I decided to go to a Christian college where I could study both science and theology. And I attended Biola University in La Mirada, California, where I could study Christianity and science. And when I graduated from Biola, I still didn't know what I wanted to do in life. I didn't know if I wanted to go to seminary or if I wanted to go to graduate school in physics. By that point, my interest in science had kind of coalesced into an interest in physics. So I applied to a number of places to go to graduate school, including Dallas Seminary, where my dad had graduated and was actually a member of their board of directors, and to a number of university or graduate schools, including UCLA. And here's where God starts to really enter into the story. Remember, when I was born, I got a letter from Dallas Seminary saying that anytime I wanted to get in, I'd be able to get into Dallas Seminary. I graduated from a Christian college with a high GPA, and my dad was even on the board of Dallas Seminary. I don't remember exactly whether he was on the board then or had been on the board. And so I sent my application to Dallas Seminary. And of course, I was rejected from Dallas Seminary. And you may ask, well, why would anybody with your credentials be rejected from Dallas Seminary? And the reason was Dallas has been around, I don't know, well over 100 years. And for 2 years in their existence, for only 2 years, they had a policy that when you wrote your application to them, if you weren't 100% certain that God was calling you into professional Christian work, they would automatically reject your application. And I wrote in my statement, my letter, that I didn't know where God was calling me, but I was considering some kind of professional Christian work. So I was rejected by Dallas Seminary. It's interesting because Dallas had that policy for 2 years. And so somewhere out there, there's somebody else who was rejected from the seminary, either in my year or in probably the second year, who really had all the credentials to get in, but God didn't want in seminary. So I'm waiting in my life to find that other person that God didn't want to go to seminary, who was rejected because of that policy. I did get accepted to do graduate work at UCLA. And to be honest, I was really naive. I had no idea what it meant to have a PhD in physics. My dad had a PhD in theology. I really had no idea that a PhD was a research degree, that you would have to do independent research. I just knew I liked science. And this is also where the story becomes interesting, which I forgot to tell you. So back then, Biola, where I went to undergraduate school, had a very small science department. In fact, they didn't offer a physics major. They only offered a physical science major, which was kind of a mixture of physics and chemistry and math. So I got accepted to UCLA without really having a physics major, and that will come into play. I was also a 22-year-old who was pretty naive and somewhat arrogant, to be honest. And I remember thinking when I got accepted to UCLA that my road in life was set. My path was now set. The reason I thought my path was set is because growing up, I'd always been pretty successful in almost everything I did. I was a good student. I was a good athlete. I played in the band. I was a good musician, and pretty much I'd had success. And I remember thinking to myself, again, some 40 years later, it sounds really arrogant, but I remember thinking to myself, well, God can't change my path at this point. I'm headed down the road to physics, and I've never failed at anything. And so I'm going to be a physicist, whether God really wants me there or not. Which is a terrible thing to say because, but that's what I thought at the time. So where do we go from there? Well, let me tell you a little bit about how physics curriculum works. There are 4 basic subjects you study in physics: classical mechanics, electrodynamics, quantum mechanics, and thermodynamics. And you actually study those at 3 different levels. And at each level, they become harder. You study those as a freshman and sophomore in college at the lower division. Then you study those as a junior and senior at college in upper division classes, and then you study those in graduate school. Well, because I had only had a physical science major and not a physics major, I had never had these 4 classes at level 2, at the graduate level or at the upper division level as an undergrad. And I didn't know that because I was naive, and Biola didn't have a physics major. They only had the physical science major. So when the very first day of graduate school, the professor started to review a subject that I had never seen because I did not have really 2 years of prerequisite classes that I was supposed to have. And I began to realize that I was extremely deficient. And I remember walking into the graduate advisor's office of a professor at UCLA named Dr. Haddock. And Dr. Haddock, I said to him, I've never had these upper division classes, and yet here I am in grad school. And Dr. Haddock looked me right in the eye. I'll never forget this. And he said, how did you get in here? And I said something like, I must have had good grades. But I thought to myself, you know, God must really want me here because I shouldn't be here at UCLA. I should have been accepted to Dallas Seminary, but I was rejected, and I should have been rejected by UCLA because I didn't have even the prerequisites, but I was accepted. And so school felt like this to me. Oops, wrong picture. So I was kind of swamped, but Dr. Haddock said, what you should do, I was taking 3 classes. He said, you should drop a class and you should try to get a B average in the 2 classes that you're taking, because if you get a B average, you can actually, you don't have to reapply to UCLA. You can take a leave of absence. You can go take the classes you never had, and then next year you could start graduate school again. So that sounded like a reasonable plan. I dropped one of the classes that I was taking, and I finished 2 classes. And at the end of the semester, here were my grades in those 2 classes. And hopefully you could do the math. I averaged a B. And so by averaging a B, I was able to take a leave of absence as a student in good standing at UCLA, and then try to learn the material by taking the undergraduate classes. And at this point, I learned a lesson about God that I knew in my head, but I finally learned in my heart. And it's this, that nothing is impossible with God. By every human standard, I should have never been accepted to physics grad school, and I should have been accepted to seminary, and my life path would have been very different. But God isn't constrained by human standards. He's not constrained by the fact that you were guaranteed admission to a seminary when you're born, and you have all the prerequisites and all the necessary requirements, and you can still be rejected. And he's not constrained by the fact that no student should ever get into grad school without having upper division physics. And yet I did. And I learned in a new way that nothing is impossible with God. And it is a great lesson learned because life is full of impossible situations where you just do not think that God could ever come through. And the answer is he can, because he proved it to me as a student at UCLA. So what did I do? I started taking undergraduate classes at UCLA in physics, and it was really different. I never had these upper division classes. I audited them. So I often joke, I have a PhD in physics, and nowhere on my transcripts will you find upper division college physics classes, because they're all taken by auditing at UCLA. And so here I was now, my second quarter at UCLA, taking undergraduate classes so I could prepare myself for grad school. And the first test I took while auditing these undergraduate classes was a test in electrodynamics. And I sat down to take the test in electrodynamics. So I think I'm now on the right path. At first, I thought I could never fail at UCLA. Then I thought I was failing for sure. And now I think I'm going to succeed because things look better. They look brighter. And so I sat down to take the very first exam in electrodynamics. And it looked like this may look to some of you. I completely blanked out. I could not remember anything that I had studied. I scribbled some stuff on the paper on the exam. It was in a yellow book, which I still have. And I turned in the exam and I got a 19. Ultimately, I got a 19 out of 100 on the exam. So I sat down literally right on this hill right here at UCLA where I'd eat lunch every day. And I pulled out the exam that I just totally bombed. And I sat down and I started working through it. And it was easy. I worked through it in pretty much perfectly, where 20 minutes before I couldn't remember a thing. And I was really frustrated and confused and angry. And I started talking to God. And I was telling God, I don't understand what you're doing. I shouldn't have been accepted to UCLA, but I was. Then I started failing UCLA. And then, I get through with an A- and a C+, and I start to take undergraduate classes and look good. And then I can't remember anything and I blank out. What are you doing? God, what is going on? And in my life, there's been a handful of times when I have been praying to God, crying out to God, and the thoughts that came into my mind were both so unexpected and so profound that I'm convinced they're from the Holy Spirit and not from me. And this was one of those times. As this, arrogant 22-year-old who thought he could never fail, cried out to God. What came to my mind was this: you've always attributed your success in life to the gifts and talents that I've given you. But you don't get success because I gave you gifts and talents. You have success because I give you the grace to use those gifts and talents. And I can take those away anytime I want, like I just did in that exam. And for the first time, I realized how much I needed God's grace. I was a Christian since I was a preschool kid. And I'd always said, God's been gracious to me. He's given me gifts and talents, and he's allowed me to succeed. But I never understood the depth of that grace, because you don't succeed because God gives you grace and talents. You don't succeed because of that. You succeed because he continues to pour his grace on you. And the way I've never blanked out on a test before, I never blanked out since, but I blanked out on that one because God wanted to say, I can take everything away at any time. And I choose to bless you and give you success because I'm gracious. And it took this arrogant 22-year-old and it humbled him. It was a lesson I needed to learn. So I got through those. Oh, by the way, talking about God's grace, that test was really hard. A 19 turned out to be a B in the class. And I ended up getting an A in that class, as well as an A in all my undergraduate classes that I took at UCLA. So I went back home for a while. I did a lot of praying that summer about what God wanted me to do and thinking about physics. And I eventually then, the next year, started back to graduate school at UCLA. And it was a different experience. I was prepared this time. Rather than just being swamped and overwhelmed, I really loved it. I love Southern California. It's a great place to live. Hiking along the mountains, or, you know, the weather is wonderful at UCLA. You're not far from the beach. I love the beach. And so I went back to UCLA and started to do graduate school. And I thought I wanted to do what was called plasma physics, which is how like nuclear fusion works. And I took a class in plasma physics and I didn't like it at all. But I did like quantum mechanics. And I told the graduate secretary, you know, if anybody has anything in quantum mechanics that they might want someone to do research, let me know. I'd like to try it. And then I got a call from a physics professor, a guy named Chuck Buchanan, and he said, I got an opening in my experimental particle physics group. And I've looked at your grades. I see what you did, you know, in those undergraduate classes you audited, and I see what you're doing in grad school. And I was wondering if you want to come work with me. Well, I had no clue what experimental particle physics was. I didn't even know what a PhD in physics was, still probably. And I said, sure, I'd love to come, you know, work in your group. And that started me down the path into particle physics, which I do now, which I love. So UCLA now was looking good. I loved it. I would go to the beach. I was a beach addict. I would go to the beach and I would take my physics books and I would spend hours laying on the beach and enjoying Southern California and learning how to do physics. You know, I've been in Oklahoma for 26 years and I still consider, you know, California home, and particularly Southern California. But in particle physics, there are only a few labs in the world where the research is actually done. So while at UCLA, you can look at the data from the lab and you can do research, but you can't really touch the experiment or do any work. And UCLA had actually built a part of the experiment that was housed at the Stanford Linear Accelerator at Stanford. So my advisor said, Dr. Buchanan said, I want you to go up to Stanford and I want you to go work on the experiment for a couple years or a year or so, because UCLA built a part of that experiment. We actually have to keep it running. And there's some other graduate students who will train you how to do that. So I went up to Northern California. I'd never been to Northern California before. And if you've lived in both Southern and Northern California, you will know that those two are very different cultures and environments. So I went up to work at the Stanford Linear Accelerator Center. And to be honest, it was kind of a culture shock for me. I didn't like Northern California. It didn't have the laid back attitude of Southern California. It was more formal. I never really made many friends up there. I lived there for about a year. I never really found a church home. And I just didn't like it. It was, you know, I love the beach, and the nearest beach was a 45-minute drive. So I had to drive to the beach every weekend to spend time at the beach. And although the experiment was okay, I didn't really like it. So when my advisor said, why don't you come back to Southern California in order to finish writing your dissertation, I thought, oh, that'd be great. So I drove back down to Southern California, where again, it's wonderful. I remember one day I actually laid on the beach and snow skied on the same day. I mean, where else in the world can you do that? It's fantastic. And so for about a year, I lived back in Southern California and really enjoyed it. The PhD was going good. Life was going good. I had friends there. I had a good church home. And then about a year after I moved back to Southern California, my advisor said, you know what? I want you to go back to Stanford, to Northern California, because we have a whole new generation of graduate students coming, and you're the only one who knows how to run that part of the detector, and I need you to go train them. And I did not want to go back to Northern California. It was, you know, to me, it was the armpit of California, or maybe the armpit of the country. I don't know. But so again, God and I got together, and I remember I was up in the San Bernardino Mountains at a retreat with Campus Crusade of Christ, and I walked over to a place where the view was probably, this is not the picture, but the view was very much like this. And I was sitting on a rock, and I was reading my Bible and trying to wrestle with God because I did not want to go to Northern California. I mean, who would when you could live in Southern California? And I began to think about biblical principles. And there's a biblical principle that says that we as Christians are supposed to be subject to the authorities that God has put over us. And the authority for me as a graduate student that God had put over me was my advisor, Dr. Buchanan. And I knew what I had to do because as a follower of Christ, I needed to be subject to the authorities. So I finally told God, okay, God, I don't want to go. There's nothing up there. It's the pits. I hate it up there, but this is what you want me to do. This is what my advisor wants, so I'm willing to go. And for the second time in my life, the thoughts that came to my mind were so profound and so unexpected that I'm convinced this was the Holy Spirit. And what came to my mind this time was, I have something good for you up there in Northern California. And I remember actually laughing, what a joke, that could never be. So anyway, in obedience to God and obedience to my advisor, I moved to Northern California. Again, I found a great church home this time, Menlo Park Presbyterian, which turned out to be one of my favorite places in the world at that time. I loved the church. It was great. And I also met somebody named Julie Reed, who we have a picture of here. And I started to date her, and that could be a good thing in Northern California. Who knows? But anyway, I finished up my dissertation at UCLA, and in the next step in any physicist career, if you want to stay in academics, is to get a postdoc job. And I remember I got a number of postdoc offers. And it's interesting because as a postdoctoral researcher, you don't usually work at the university you're employed by. You work at the lab where the experiment is. So here were the 5 places I got offers from, and they wanted me to work at labs all over the world, including one of them wanted me to work at the lab in Switzerland, one wanted me to work at a lab in New York, one in Chicago, but only one offer wanted me to work at the lab at Stanford. And on paper, that offer looked like the worst offer, both professionally and personally. But I took it anyway, because I was dating this girl named Julie Reed, and I didn't want to give that up. So I became a postdoc with the University of Massachusetts, working at the Stanford Linear Collider. And it was a good decision, because about a year later, Julie and I got married. And that was the good thing that God had for me. I mean, I felt like, Nathaniel, when Philip tells him that Jesus is from Nazareth, and Nathaniel goes, can any good thing come from Nazareth? And I felt, can any good thing come from Northern California? And I met my wife there. We've been married 32 years. The best thing that ever happened came from Northern California. Both of my kids were born there. One was born at Stanford, Zach, and one was born at Santa Clara Hospital, Chris. And God taught me another lesson that if you walked with him for a while, you probably know. And that lesson was, that as for God, his way is perfect. He has a path for us. And that path is not always the path that we think is best. Who would ever want to live in Northern California? But his path is always perfect. And he led me on that path. And it was the best thing that ever happened. It's funny because I've come to love Northern California. If I had unlimited resources and could choose anywhere to live, it would most likely be somewhere in Northern California. So what a difference that, happens when God works in your life. So back then, this was I was doing a postdoc at Stanford, and the next career step would be finding a faculty position. At that time, the US was building a super collider in Texas around the Waxahachie called the Superconducting Super Collider. And in 1992, they shut that project down. And as far as employment for particle physicists, it was a disaster. All of a sudden, 100 particle physicists were out of work and had to find jobs, people who were working at the lab. And I was looking for a faculty job, and there were no jobs because 100 senior people were looking for jobs. And so I began to look in the Bay Area for possibly a job outside of academics. I didn't know what to do. Again, I'm praying to God, what should I do? And an opportunity came up to do an interview at the University of Oklahoma. Well, I'm a Californian, and if you're a Californian, you have, no idea where Oklahoma is, or if anybody other than tumbleweeds and buffalo even live in Oklahoma. You know the Dust Bowl's Oklahoma. So I remember when I applied to the job at the University of Oklahoma, I didn't even tell my wife that I was applying for the job. But when they offered me an interview, I had to tell her I was going. And it was very interesting because I was actually interviewing at the University of Oklahoma on the day of the second worst domestic terrorism act in the US, the day that Tim McVeigh blew up the Murrah building. I was about 30 miles away, 20 miles away, interviewing at the University of Oklahoma. And it was interesting because my wife, who had no preconceived idea she would ever want to move to Oklahoma, saw this bombing, and the Spirit spoke to her and said, you need to watch how these people react to this tragedy, because these people are going to be your neighbors. I got the job at the University of Oklahoma. It's a great place to work. There are so many hidden gems at this university. We have one of the best history of science museums in the world, where since the printing press was invented, scientific books written by famous people are stored at the University of Oklahoma. It's one of the only libraries with all of Galileo's writings and all of Newton's writings in printed form in any single place. I've held a copy of Galileo's original dialogues, the first edition dialogues book, in which he talked about the heliocentric universe, with his writing in the margin about what Galileo wants to change in the second edition. I mean, there are so many wonderful things, and it's been a great place for a career. But here's what I learned again, things that Scripture tells us that I learned in a new way, that God will direct your steps. The reason that, well, not the reason, but when I was waiting, when the super collider was shut down and I thought there's no way I'm going to get a job, and all of my favorite places that I thought I really wanted to work were hiring other people. And the only thing left 2 years later was the University of Oklahoma. It was God directing my steps. I mean, did God shut down the super collider so I could work at Oklahoma? I don't know, but it was a result of his direction and his directing my steps. And so I'm there because of all these circumstances that, again, were unusual, but God was directing my steps. For about 20 years, I did research at the Fermi National Laboratory near Chicago, which is a picture of, where I studied how quarks and gluons make up the proton, as I talked about a little bit. For the last 10 years, I've been doing my research at CERN in Geneva. I usually travel there 3 or 4 times a year until the pandemic hit. But I'm on video to CERN and to Europe and all over the world pretty much every day. I have data from my accelerator, from my detector there at Oklahoma, and we can look at the data and do analysis on our computers, even though we're not physically at the lab. But it's interesting because, I thought I wanted to do plasma physics when I started at UCLA, but God had other plans. He directed me into particle physics. And one could argue that apart from maybe astrophysics, particle physics is the most publicly known type of physics out there. Here are just some magazines, including Time and Newsweek. This Time magazine, Fabiola was the spokesperson of the experiment that I'm on that discovered the Higgs boson. She was the leader of the experiment. She's now the leader of the entire CERN laboratory. And she was a runner-up for Person of the year that the Higgs was discovered. And people know about particle physics. I was on an airplane and the flight attendant noticed as we were getting near landing, and he asked me to put my laptop away. He noticed something about particle physics on my laptop, and he said, what do you do? And I say, I'm a particle physicist at University of Oklahoma who works at CERN. He said, I wish I'd known that. I would have sat in the empty seat beside you and talked about particle physics the whole way. And the reason I find it interesting is it's opened up innumerable opportunities that I never thought I would have. I literally spoken all over the world about science and Christianity. And I have an opportunity to talk about science and Christianity because I'm a particle physicist and a Christian. I don't know how many times I've had someone come up to me and say, "You don't know me, but I was an atheist and I saw a talk you gave on scientific evidence for the existence of God, and it started me on a road to become a Christian." And for me, it's such a privilege. I mean, you heard my story. An arrogant 22-year-old who thinks he can't fail at everything and doesn't even know what a PhD in physics means, and should be in Dallas Seminary and is at UCLA. And then God humbles that kid, and he gives him the privilege of being able to share Christ with others and have open opportunities because God called me into particle physics. And the lesson I learned here is a lesson, for everyone. It's to let your light shine wherever God's called you. I have unique gifts and talents, but so do you. You have people in your life who no one else will be able to touch with the gospel of Christ or with the love of Christ, but you can, because of your unique gifts and your unique education and your unique upbringing. I have three brothers. One brother has since passed away, but I've had three brothers who spend their whole life as seminary professors or missionaries. Their whole life as pastors, doing 60 hours a week, what we call professional Christian work. And I say, I spend 60 hours a week being a physicist and 10 hours a week maybe doing some kind of ministry. And what they say to me is what I know. They say, yeah, but you can talk to certain people who won't give us the time of day. And it's true. I've had people come to me saying, I never thought you could be a thinking person and be a Christian. I never thought you could be a real scientist and be a Christian. And because of this unique path that God has led me on, I have opportunities to share Christ. And so do you. You have unique positions that only you have, and only people that you can touch. And any of you could tell a story like mine that says God's prepared me to do things for him. Anyway, for more information about science and Christianity, you get it from Hugh, what do I have to offer? But I wrote a book on this subject. I've got a blog, a YouTube channel. Let me tell you why I wrote the book, because it does have to do with Hugh, actually. I don't know if he knows his story, but I had a friend who was homeschooling her kid, and she wanted to know what I believed about the origin of the universe and the Bible. How did God use the Big Bang or whatever to create the universe, and how does that agree with the Bible? So I gave her some of Hugh's books and some of Reasons to Believe books. And even though she had a college degree, they were hard to understand. I mean, Hugh writes at a high level. And I realized that there was very little that the average Christian could read. Average is the wrong word, that a lay Christian could read, a non-technical Christian who doesn't really, isn't familiar with all the scientific language that we often use. What could they read that really showed how good science points to God and how that agrees with the story of creation in the Bible? And so this book was written for that audience originally, the non-technical Christian who wants to understand how science and scripture fits together. The content of the book is highly influenced by Reasons to Believe in Hugh, but the style is my own, and that was the purpose of it. So anyway, I think that's all I have to share, and I'd love to get questions or feedback from all of you.
Okay, thank you, Mike. We have a question from Doug McComb, and actually has a couple of questions built into it. Says, assuming it's true that God is and has always been omnipresent, was he in the universe before it was created? It seems to me obviously not, but could you comment on that? Or is that just an illogical question with no answer?
Yeah, there's certainly illogical questions with no answers. I guess to me, omnipresent means being present everywhere that exists. If the universe doesn't exist, then God can't be present in it. But the moment it starts to exist, then of course he could be present in it. So I think, For instance, we say God is omnipotent. Well, what does that mean? Does it mean he can make a square circle? No, you can't make a square circle. That's a logical impossibility. So omnipotence means he can do everything that's possible. And so, I think it's important to realize that omnipresent means being present everywhere that exists. And of course, God, being God, has the ability to create existence that didn't previously exist because he's self-existent.
So if to pursue his question more, he says, since God is omnipresent, does God the Father reside in heaven? And if so, where in heaven? There's different heavens.
Yeah, so, God gives us revelation about himself in language that we can understand, but is fully necessarily incomplete. One of my favorite books to try to illustrate this is the book Flatland, written by Edwin Abbott in the 19th century. And if you haven't read it, it's not a great book as far as literature, but the message is great, right? It's about this culture, this universe that is flat. It's two-dimensional. And they're called Flatlanders. And somebody like us who's three-dimensional is called a Spacelander. And in the story, the Spacelander tries to explain himself to the Flatlander, and he can't. No matter how much the Spacelander tries to explain, the Flatlander can't get it. And the difference is only one dimension, a two-dimensional universe versus a three. And what you realize is that you cannot understand, you can't even understand, I can't even understand 4 dimensions because I'm bound to a 3-dimensional universe. And so there's no way I can understand God. So he tries to explain himself in terms that are familiar to me, but clearly don't give a complete representation of who he is. So why do we talk about, I saw the question earlier, why do we talk about God sitting on his throne, or whatever in heaven? Because it's language we can understand. It's truly not a perfectly accurate picture of what God is like, because he is omnipresent. And so how does he sit on a throne? I don't know. And do I expect to know? Of course not. If Christianity were a man-made religion, as some atheists say it is, or all religions, then everything about it should be comprehensible to man. But if it's a real religion or a real worldview or a real truth from an omnipotent, omnipresent God who's trying to explain himself to finite people, then there are going to be many things about his explanation of who he is that we can't fully comprehend. And this is one of those. Why do we ascribe a position to God, like in heaven and on the throne, when we know he's omnipresent? Will we ever be able to understand that? Maybe someday when we see him face to face. And to think that we can understand it is to not understand how unlimited God really is and how limited we really are. A lesson I learned quite dramatically as I grew up, how limited I really am.
Thank you. Susan Lambeau asks, have we measured the two-way speed of light, and why is it so difficult? I think she means the one-way speed of light, but you can answer the question as it's posed.
Right. Yeah, this is a young Earth creation argument that we don't measure. Every time we try to measure light, it's always in 2 directions. And one of the ideas about why the universe looks old and it's really young is that the speed of light is different in different directions. But again, if you think about it, the concept is absurd, because what it means is that the Earth is the center of the universe, and light coming at us from every direction travels instantaneously, and light going away from us in every direction. So it's not even directional. It's Earth, it's geocentric. So there are ways to indirectly infer the speed of light in one direction. You can measure the electromagnetic coupling constant at far distances. You can measure redshifts, and you can infer the speed of light. So I think that this concept, this idea, this postulate that the speed of light, is different depending on what direction it goes, first of all, has no basis at all. It's a wild idea to try to back up a single interpretation of scripture, which I don't even think is the best interpretation of scripture. And there are indirect things that seem to indicate that light has the same speed in all directions. And if you postulate it has different speeds in different directions, you really are postulating that if it's coming to the Earth from any direction, it's basically instantaneous. And again, that's not a directionality. It's the Earth is truly the center of the universe, and somehow the laws of physics are different on the Earth than other places. And that just violates everything that we can measure in the universe. Thank you.
Susan also mentioned that, do you think the supernova SN Revstal, first seen November 11, 2014, put to rest the anisotropic synchrony convention as proposed by Jason Lisle?
I think that the evidence for a 14 billion year old universe is irrefutable and overwhelming. And I think any proposals other than that are insufficient attempts to try to back up. They're sincere. They're trying to, people like Jason Lisle are trying to uphold the integrity of Scripture, but I think their science has no experimental basis at all.
Thank you. Susan also asks, what are you working on at CERN right now?
Yeah, two things primarily. I am studying the Higgs boson. Our theory not only says that it should exist, but that it should have certain particular properties. And measuring the properties is much, much more challenging than just seeing it exist. And we are still, we've worked on this for 10 years to make precision measurements of the properties of the Higgs boson. And there's even proposals for building future colliders to make more precision measurements, because the precision measurements can tell us much about the universe. So one thing I'm looking at is making measurements of the properties of the Higgs boson. The other thing is that many theories predict that there are other particles like the Higgs boson. One theory predicts there are 5 types of Higgs bosons in the universe. And so I'm looking for the possibility of those other Higgs bosons existing. So that's primarily what I'm doing right now.
Fantastic, thank you. Mark Durham asks, thank the Lord for your salvation, Dr. Strauss. What are your thoughts about string theory? Is this a dying theory, or is it going to remain? Or will we ever see such a thing?
Yeah, somebody in the chat said that they saw me talk at Reasons to Believe chapter in Indianapolis just on Thursday, and this same question came up, so they may hear the same thing again. So on Thursday, at University of Oklahoma, we actually had a colloquium from a Cornell professor about the status of string theory. And string theory is very much alive. One of the predictions of string theory was that we should see these particles called supersymmetric particles, and we haven't seen them yet at CERN. And so because we haven't seen supersymmetric particles, that made people in the popular press and some scientists kind of reject string theory, because string theory predicts supersymmetric particles. But there are many theories of supersymmetric particles that say we shouldn't have seen them yet at CERN, and that's why we haven't. So string theory is very much alive. The string theorists are still making good progress in their understanding of what string theory might look like. Whether or not it's ever verifiable with the technology we have, it's hard to say. It depends on certain aspects of string theory and how they might reveal themselves. String theory requires at least 10 dimensions, the 4 we live in, 3 space and 1 time, and at least 6 other dimensions. We say those dimensions are most likely what we call curled up. So as the universe expanded and space got bigger, these dimensions didn't. They stayed really, really tiny, but we don't know how tiny. If their size is a micron, which is the size a little thinner than a human hair, we might someday see that. In fact, at CERN, we're looking for what we call extra dimensions. If we find extra dimensions, it is a good indication that string theory might have validity. If the extra dimensions are small on what we might call the order of the Planck scale, if you know what that means, we'll never see them most likely. So it's hard to know whether we'll ever find experimental evidence for string theory or not, but the theory itself is still being developed. It still has lots of promise. It certainly hasn't been ruled out by the lack of finding supersymmetric particles at CERN. In fact, I wrote a blog on this. So if you go to my blog and you Google and you type in the search engine SUSY, SUSY, or supersymmetry, you can find a blog I wrote on that the reports of the death of string theory have been highly exaggerated.
Thank you. Could Susan Lambeau asks, could dark matter consist of bosons, perhaps?
No, not the bosons we know of. There are other kinds of bosons. We know of many bosons in the universe. In fact, force carriers are bosons. The thing that most people think that the dark matter is what we call WIMPs, which stands for weakly interacting massive particles. A boson is just a type of particle. It has spin 0. It has quantum mechanical spin that's an integer of h bar, 0 or 1 or 2. And it's certainly possible that these could be bosons or fermions, which have half integer spin. But the main characteristic of the most likely scenario for dark matter, weakly interacting massive particles, is that they are some kind of matter with mass that hardly interacts with the particles we know of. And the particles we know of only make up 4% of the energy density of the universe. So there's 96% of the energy density of the universe in dark matter and dark energy that we haven't yet discovered. We know it's out there because we can see its effect from gravity, but we don't know what it is. So for budding physicists, I tell them, you've got 96% of the universe at least that is yet undiscovered. So there's a lot of work to be done still.
That's good for physics employment.
Yes.
What are the practical applications of your Higgs boson research?
Who knows? Particle physics, there are applications, but they're probably far down the road. So I always say that the goal of a scientist is to understand nature. The goal of the engineer is to take that understanding and help benefit society with new inventions. But there's a time lag. In the 1930s and 40s, scientists were studying things called semiconductors. And if you'd ask the scientists, well, what is the practical application of a semiconductor, they wouldn't have known. But of course, semiconductors, because now we understand them, are the brains of every computer. Every computer has semiconductor chips that run them. But if we hadn't studied the semiconductors in the 30s and 40s, we wouldn't have iPhones and laptops, today. And so particle physics is somewhat like that. We don't know what the long-term applications are. We only know that if we don't understand nature, there are no long-term applications. But the other thing you get when you do particle physics is you get spin-offs. We developed technology to smash protons together, and that technology has applications that we never thought about. One of the biggest applications is curing cancer. Shooting protons at tumors can cure them. It's called proton therapy. The first people to build the first proton therapy machine were scientists from Fermilab in Chicago, and they built it at Loma Linda in California. And this was a trial proposal. Can you shoot protons into tumors and cure cancer? And the only people with the technological ability to build such a machine were the accelerator physicists at Fermilab. And now there are proton machines all over. So if you ask particle physics, is your research going to cure cancer? We'd say no. But lo and behold, the technology we developed does cure cancer. But the other technology we developed that most has influenced your life, you've probably heard of this thing called the World Wide Web. The World Wide Web was actually invented by a particle physicist at CERN in order to share data with the particle physicists at Fermilab easier, which is in Chicago. So we were exchanging information over the internet between CERN in Geneva and Chicago Fermilab, but it wasn't very efficient. And somebody at CERN thought there's got to be a more efficient way to transfer information and built the World Wide Web, actually. In fact, I have an office at CERN, and I'm on the first floor, and on the basement below, there's a plaque that says, in these walls, the World Wide Web was invented. And so whenever you do high-tech things like smash particles together, you have technologies that we develop for our use that have further applications that we would never have even thought of. And those do affect people now. And then future technology will most likely affect you later.
Thank you. Norm Helgeson asks, how does the Higgs boson compare as a fundamental particle to gluons and Gelman's particles? He forgot the name.
Yeah, so it is a fundamental particle. It's different than, so gluons and what we call intermediate vector bosons and photons, these are force carrier particles, and they're all bosons. They carry forces from one particle to another. The Higgs boson is a little different. We think it's a fundamental particle. We don't think it's made of anything else, but it's the only fundamental particle that's not made of anything else that has a spin zero. We call a scalar particle. And that makes it unique. So even though it's got similarities to other fundamental particles, there are certain aspects of it which before we discovered it, we didn't even know could exist necessarily. Can you have a fundamental spin zero particle? Although it's predicted by the theory, until you see it, you're not sure. And we're still trying to do experiments to see if it's made of something smaller. As with all the particles we know, the universe is made of quarks and leptons and bosons or force carrier bosons. And we always try to determine whether those are fundamental or made of something else. String theory says they're made of vibrating strings of energy. So this is the fun part of my job. You know, in school, you're always taking tests, and the answers to those tests are somewhere in the back of the book or somewhere. In research, we don't know the answers. I don't know if the Higgs boson is made of something smaller or if there is anything smaller. And if we find that out, we will be the first humans to know that. So, and as we discover these things, we really do learn about, I as a Christian learn about God. I have a friend who's an artist. He says, when you look at a piece of art, you see the soul of the artist. As a physicist, I get to look at God's piece of art, his creation. And I do see aspects of God's character, his soul, in a way different than someone who doesn't get to look at his creation so intently. Just like the art expert sees things in a painting that tells him about the artist that I would never see, I, as the physicist, get to see things in God's painting that tell me about his character that someone else might not actually see. It's a great privilege.
Thank you. I have a question from MVP 2120, who says, do you have optimism for nuclear hydrogen, thorium, or some other source of energy?
I think someday we'll probably be able to have fusion energy, which is the way the sun works. I think that's still down the road, but it's a pretty unlimited source of energy if we could ever tap into it. And the nuclear waste is much, much more manageable than in the current reactors we have. I actually think nuclear energy is a good option if you handle it well. Hydrogen is not really an energy source, it's an energy storage. You basically have water, and somehow you separate the oxygen from the hydrogen and water, and you put the hydrogen in a tank, and then when you burn that hydrogen, it goes back to water. So the real question is, how do you separate the hydrogen from the oxygen in the first place? So it's, you know, you could use it in a car because you can take the hydrogen and put it in the car and it's your energy storage. If you can separate the hydrogen from the oxygen using like solar energy, then you have a completely clean cycle. Solar energy creates electricity that separates the hydrogen from the oxygen. You put the hydrogen in your car, you burn it, and you get water out the tailpipe. And so, you know, I think that some of these things have real promise in the future. Direct solar energy with solar cells has come a long way, much faster than we thought. It's certainly a promise. I mean, you know, I live in a very red state, and people ask me all the time things like, do you believe in global warming? And my answer is the Earth is warming and humans are part of the problem. But even if not, fossil fuels are dirty and they are limited. And if we were smart, we would find sources of energy that are cleaner and unlimited, even or renewable, even if there was no such thing as global warming. And so I think all of these technologies show promise, and you know, we need to smartly figure out how we can transfer to other cleaner, renewable energy, yet still maintain the technological society that we've come to depend on, which right now still does require some level of fossil fuel.
Thank you. MDP asks also, are you encountering social or it looks like critical race theory, gender justice, et cetera, theories encroaching into the sciences or other subjects that you?
Oh, that's a politically charged question, right? So, you know, yes, the answer is that this world is temporary. This world is influenced by humans who are sinners, and this world is highly influenced by an adversary of God who doesn't want people to know Christ. And there are attacks on many, many things that God says are valuable. And those attacks are going to continue no matter where you live until Christ comes again. And I think we as Christians need to find a way to build bridges, not walls. God never said we were going to build the perfect society here. He said you would follow a narrow way. You would always be, foolish in the eyes of some. And our goal is to lead them to Christ. I love Jesus with the woman at the well. There was a social outcast who had very different ideas than the religious people of the day. And Christ's goal was not to set her straight with all of her ideas. It was to bring her to a relationship with him and let that relationship change who she was. And that's what I see we should do as Christians. At times that definitely means fighting social injustice and speaking truth, but always in a way that draws people to Christ, not in a way that makes them want to separate from who Jesus is.
Thank you. Doug McComb asks, how big would you want a large collider to be? And with what degree of added precision would you get?
You can't give us enough money to build the big colliders we always want, right? Men just want to play with bigger toys. Scientists want to play with bigger toys. CERN is talking about building a 100-kilometer collider next, 60 miles in circumference. That's about the size of the super collider that was being built in Texas. I think that is probably the next step in what we call a hadron collider. There's other types of colliders. There are lepton colliders that use probably different technologies and would be a little smaller. But I think if we want to build the next hadron collider, it's on the order of 100 kilometers around. And I don't know the cost. Tens of billions. Again, in the scope of what the US spends, and this is a worldwide collaboration, is nothing. Didn't Congress just pass a $2 trillion budget? What would be $20 billion in a $2 trillion budget? Nothing. In fact, this is something that I speak a lot when I talk to community groups, Kiwanis clubs and all. Science budgets in the US are declining. They've been declining for years. We are not a first world country in many science. We used to have the world's premier particle physics lab in Chicago. We were going to build the world's premier particle physics lab in Texas. We don't. We now all go to CERN and spend billions of dollars at CERN to do research. It's because the US doesn't care anymore about being the world's leader in science. But you could build the world's best collider for tens of billions of dollars. And what is that in a $2 trillion infrastructure package? And in fact, it would make tremendous numbers of jobs, but the electorate doesn't care. When was the last time in a presidential debate, somebody asked, what are you going to do to fund basic science research? And when was the last time the public cared? So unfortunately, we are not a leader in science in the way we used to be. The world's biggest plasma research is done in Europe. The world's biggest particle physics research is done in Europe. They used to all be done here. And until we as an electorate start caring, science is going to be done overseas in China at a much more rapid rate. China's going to soon surpass us in space because they care about science and we don't anymore.
Thank you.
That's my soapbox.
Well said, by the way. Susan Lambeau asks, should we start building thorium reactors?
I don't know much about thorium reactors. That came up in the other comments. So Hugh knows something about everything. I'll let him answer that question when he gets back. I'm off to look up thorium reactors since it came, in 2 questions, but I don't know a lot about it. If by reactor it's some kind of nuclear energy, I've always been a proponent of nuclear energy. It's one of the cleanest energies there is, and your bang for your buck is great. Fission does have, problems with radioactive material that's left over, but we know how to handle some of it. A lot of it can be recycled and et cetera. So I've always been a fan of nuclear energy. Many parts of the world, many industrialized countries use a lot more nuclear energy than us to get, and it's much cleaner. You don't have greenhouse gases at all. But again, I'll have to look up thorium. I don't know much about it.
Okay, Susan Lambeau mentions that thorium doesn't leave radioactive decay, but we'll leave that for your research later on.
Yeah.
Craig McMahon asks, is it even vaguely possible to produce a graviton through any particle interaction in a collider?
Yes, if they exist. The problem is not creating them, it'd be seeing them. Because gravity at the subatomic level is about 10 to the minus 34th times weaker than the other forces. So to see a single graviton in a particle collider, you have to see effects that are in the 34th place of the decimal. And we just don't measure that accurately. And one of the questions that string theory and other things try to answer is, why is gravity so weak compared to the other forces? So the problem wouldn't be creating gravitons. If they exist, we probably created them. The problem is then, recognizing and measuring that one's there, because again, the strength of gravity at the subatomic level is so small, it plays absolutely no role in our experiments.
Thank you. Our time is up, Mike. I want to say thank you. I know we've got lots of people saying thank you through the chats. This has certainly been one of the best presentations I've ever seen, not just here on Reasons to Believe, but elsewhere too. It's fantastic to hear your story and to be reminded of God's place in our lives, all of us. And so you've been very, very, very helpful and obviously answered a lot of fantastic questions. So thank you so much for your time. Is there anything you want to say before we close?
No, just thank you for coming. And again, it's a privilege to be able to share some of my life and to be able to answer your questions, and perhaps we can do it again sometime, but I appreciate your gracious response to me. Thank you.
Thank you, Mike, and thank everyone else. And we'll see you next week. I believe Hugh is back next week, and we'll commence again as we did today. Thank you much, Mike, and everyone else. Lord bless you all.
All right, bye.